Okay, so in the interest of time, I'd like to welcome you all again. My name is Fred Dahlmann. I'm based at Warwick Business School at the University of Warwick in the UK. And this is the fourth of our webinar in the virtual roundtable series of the ESG Earth System Governance SDG Taskforce. This afternoon, we're interested in private sector governance for the SDGs. And we have two guest speakers who will introduce in just a moment and who will talk about their backgrounds and engagement interaction with the SDGs. But together with me on this panel, my co-host is Joanna Stanberry. Joanna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Joanna Stanberry. I'm a postgraduate researcher at the University of Cumbria in the northwest of England, but worked for 15 to 20 years in industry prior to coming to do work on informal learning and the private sector for the SDGs. And so Fred and I have been engaged with the Earth System Governance Group now for Fred for longer than I, but me for a little less than a year. And we really look forward to having a great discussion. I think we're hoping this is a bit of an informal engagement together today.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. I'm still seeing people joining in, so it's wise to hold just for another second or so. As always, people joining in from different platforms, trying to get used to the technology. But hopefully we'll have everyone assembled here. So SDGs and business. So that's the big topic of this afternoon. Plenty of reasons for us to be paying attention, obviously, to the global picture and the international picture of the big challenges from climate change to loss of biodiversity, but also poverty and inequality. And so, you know, within this wider framework of changes and challenges in the world, the question is not only what do governments and legislators are doing in this space, but what's the role of the private sector? And to help us address some of these big questions, what are the sort of driving forces and barriers that are effectively holding us back in many ways from making progress? We have two guest speakers here with us. First of all, we have Joe Appleby, who is the Head of Sustainable Innovation at Impact International. We have Amy King from the organization called Paragon Impact, based in Jersey. We'll start off by listening to Joe, and Joe will sort of give us her view and background on what the SDGs are doing for her, how she's working with the SDGs in the private sector before we hand over to Amy. After that, we'll sort of have a bit of a smaller panel discussion before opening it up to everyone else for wider Q&A. But as we said, the idea is to have as much interaction and questions coming forward as possible. So do please feel free to add to the chat box, and we'll try and either bring in questions or even draw on you directly if you prefer. So without further ado, can I hand over to Joe? Are you happy to talk to us about your background and your engagement with the SDGs, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Fred, for the introduction and the invitation to share some of my experiences around the SDGs. My name is Joe Appleby, and I am the Head of Sustainable Innovation at Impact. I'm originally from London. I moved to the Lakes a long time ago. I was very late into the world of work, due mostly to my passion for travel and experiencing new places and people. And before I started the kind of working at Impact, I spent quite a lot of time traveling, working on community projects in Belize, in the US, and I did a couple of ski seasons as well. And it was during that time that I met this bunch of people who talked about this organization called Impact. They talked about running fantastic programs, developing people across different organizations and in some really amazing environments. And they seemed to really like each other too. And I looked at this organization and thought, that's the type of organization I want to work for, doing really meaningful work, helping to develop people and organizations across the world. So I set my target for Impact, and that was 25 years ago. So it was obviously the right decision. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, what? She must be completely institutionalized, being within an organization for 25 years. Or maybe it's actually because I'm still feel that I can carve out my own journey at Impact, and I still do really meaningful work, of which some of that is working with the SDGs. So Impact is an organization, just to put a little bit of context, It's a people development organisation. We could design and deliver powerful, immersive leadership experiences for people and organisations. Our purpose is to work and partner with our clients to solve economic, environmental and social issues that face us. And we do that through liberating human potential. We design and run bespoke learning solutions for organisations across multiple sectors and also across the world. We've got 17 locations that we operate from, and we're headquartered in the Lake District. Some of you may know of the Lake District, but many of you may not have heard of it. But we're headquartered there, and we've got offices in 17 locations, and we've been around for about 43 years. Our roots as an organisation is firmly in experiential learning, and we use a variety of different methodologies to bring that learning to life. So back in the 1980s, that was about using the outdoors as this really powerful vehicle for people to learn about themselves, about leadership, and about building that capacity to take leadership action. So a lot of our programs are really focused around enabling leaders to have more self-awareness and build that capacity to take action within and across their organizations. So I was lucky enough with Impact to have the opportunity to live in Japan for a few years. And when I came back in 2004, was just at the time that CSR, let's start bringing some acronyms into this webinar. But yes, CSR was starting to be a bit of a deal for organisations. Corporate social responsibility was starting to be something that businesses were paying more attention to. And it was during that time that Impact as an organisation, and I guess my passion for sustainability, we started to broker relationships between community organisations and businesses. And we did that for mutual benefit and learning. And it became a really powerful way to engage leaders on issues that were important within their community. So a really powerful way to bring that learning to life. And I think through that, I kind of stumbled into this world of sustainability, which kind of took heart of my kind of passion, if you like. And I kind of started to work more or less on sustainability within our organisations and also supporting our clients and helping them to embed the mindset of sustainability across within their organisations. So it was during that time, and what I'd like to kind of spend a little bit of time sharing with you is some of those experiences I've had specifically around the SDGs. I feel like I've been, since 2015 when the SDGs came out, I've been like a massive advocate for the SDGs and really passionate. And then I think at some stage in the last few years, I became a bit of a SDG bore. And people used to kind of, within the organisation that I work with, Impact, would be like, oh, Jo's always talking about the SDGs. She's really passionate about them. And I had a mission to embed the SDGs within every single leadership programme that we designed globally, because I saw it as such a useful framework in which people could talk about stuff that matters to them and stuff that matters to their organisation and society. And I've shifted now from being that being that SDG bore to sometimes feeling like a protective parent over the SDGs. Like I see how they are perhaps not living up to those expectations that we had. And at the same time, I'm fiercely protective of them because I think as a framework and as a tool, they're such a useful way for us to connect different organisations and different people. So let me just bring up a couple of examples for how I've worked with the SDGs. So internally at Impact, I helped drive engagement in the SDGs. And I'm just going to share with you one practical thing that I did that might be useful. One of the things that I wanted to do was to have the SDGs on every single program that we deliver. And so what I designed was these SDG cards. You can't see them, it doesn't matter too much, but I designed cards like this. I gave them to every single facilitator. And then I also provided ways in which we could use the SDGs, whether or not you're in a sales meeting, whether or not you're on a program, or whether or not you were designing a program. Because I think, again, the SDGs became a really useful way to have conversations with our clients or with customers or on programs. So that was one way that I engaged people internally at Impact. But most of my role is around how I design leadership programs for clients across different sectors and how I embed that in the programs that we deliver at Impact. So let me give you some examples. When I worked with Vita, now they make foam. They're not the sexiest of organisations, but they've got a really clear strategy around being the leading ESG foam manufacturer in Europe. And so, knowing that was their key target to be a leader in ESG, it meant when I was designing programs for their chief executive and his senior team, and for their high potentials, and for their general managers, I could embed the SDGs within that program so that they had awareness of what the SDGs are, and that they had kind of agency within their part of their organisation to embed those SDGs and help them make sense for people, to help people do different things within organisations. One of the things that we did, I'll just give you an example. So on the High Potential programme, we ran something, you may have heard of it, it's called the SDG 2030 game. It's a gamification process, but it's a really good way of engaging people and helping them to be more aware of what the SDGs are. The second part of the engagement was then about the participants on the programme coming up with what if, how might we scenarios, and leading projects that address the SDGs as well as ESG within that organisation. They worked on those projects for 6 months, and then they delivered the impact that they made to the chief exec and the senior leadership team. And it helped to create a language throughout the organisation of the SDGs and how they related to the ambitions of the organisation. So done right, if you provide awareness for people within organisations and you align it to their wider strategy, it's a really good way of helping people to articulate the SDGs and how they align to the business strategy. That was a really good way for us to do that. It doesn't always happen that way. For some of the clients I work with, I have to put them in stealthily. I kind of design the SDGs into the program without the client necessarily knowing they're doing it. So, for example, when I worked with an automobile organisation, it was a 3-day program around leadership and building leadership capability. One of the first sessions that we looked at was understanding our values. So it was around self-awareness, understanding what our values are and how they drive our behaviours within organisation. So I started it off by talking about the SDGs, and I asked them the question, what matters most to you and your family? I put the SDG cards up around the room, and people would gravitate towards the one that spoke to them most. And that meant that people could have a really interesting conversation about why is it why that SDG relates to them? What value does that bring up for them? So you very quickly can have a really meaningful conversation with people at a much deeper level by using the SDGs as that vehicle. So the client didn't know that I put it in. I just put it in there because I knew that by using the SDGs, it raised that conversation. Interestingly, I ran this program 2 weeks ago in France with the automobile organisation. And this is an organisation that's really focused on net zero, scope 3, really ambitious in its targets. Not one person in the room, and this is 20 people who have work across Europe. Not any one of those people knew of the SDGs. So in terms of our awareness, we are still really woefully unaware of the impact of what the SDGs are, and it's quite disappointing, if I'm honest. But actually, by bringing that awareness to people during lunch, they all were talking about the SDGs. So where are the opportunities where we can bring the SDGs in to help people talk about it? One other example I'll very quickly give you. I work with the UN Global Compact on a lot. I've partnered with them on a lot of programs. Obviously, they are heavily SDG related. One of the programs I work on is called SDGI, which is for under 35-year-olds. They're a fantastically ambitious, hardworking bunch of really talented under 35-year-olds across different organisations in the UK, and their role is to go from ideation through to into concept through to delivery of SDG related projects that align with their business strategy. And I help them take the SDGs and try and make sense of what they mean to their organisation, and then design and deliver projects around the SDGs. I love working with that population of people because they're still really optimistic and positive about change that can happen. And the SDGs, again, become a really powerful vehicle for that change to happen. Quite quickly, because I'm probably running out of time, just a few things from my point of view around kind of the opportunities. So I think if you're an organisation that hasn't got any sort of strategy in place yet, I think the SDGs serve as a really robust, well thought out plan of action to how you can embed some really well structured approaches to ESG. The Sustainable Development Goals, the amount of detail is just so overlooked most of the time, which is really disappointing. I see lots of organisations talk about the goals that they support, and then when you ask them about the targets or the indicators, it suddenly gets a bit woolly and they don't really know what they are. So for an organisation that's just starting out, you've already got a great structure in which to help you plan what you can do to achieve or to get close to some of the SDGs. I still think it's a brilliant framework in which to galvanise different diverse points of view to think about where collective action can be taken. But I think some of the barriers is that time's really running out. Far from actually achieving some of the SDGs, we're woefully behind. There's a report out in the UK it's called Measuring Up 2.0, and it looks at the performance of specifically the UK in relation to the SDGs, and we're performing well on 17% of the targets, and there's inadequate performance on 64%. And I think some people are almost becoming slightly disillusioned by the SDGs because of the amount of work that needs to be done. And there's no blame here. There's, we're living in a time of permacrisis where there's so much going on, and it hasn't helped us to get towards the goals. But I wonder if some people are almost giving up on them slightly because the likelihood of us getting closer to them is diminishing. And I think the other thing about it is it becomes very technical. The SDGs and embedding the SDGs becomes very technical. And it's a people agenda. I firmly believe sustainability is a people agenda. We need to help people engage with what matters to them and help to drive sustainable change within our organisations. There's a bit more, but I'm going to stop there. I hope that's been useful.
Very, very good. Thank you very much, Joe. That's very detailed and lots of great food for thought there. Certainly the way in which you engage with companies, your personal motivations, and how that sort of is fitting through into your work with the private sector. And I think you sort of spoke about the different reasons how you do this, sometimes obviously and sometimes stealthily. So we can unpack some of the reasons behind that. And I think towards the end, as you point out, the perhaps growing lack of progress leading towards some form of disillusionment is perhaps a bigger concern for us all, whether we're looking at this from a private or public sector governance perspective. I'm going to hand over to Amy now, who's going to talk to us about her role and involvement, and then we'll sort of lead that into the discussion. So over to Amy, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fred, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. I'm based on a small island called Jersey. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's just a few miles off the northwest coast of France. And a few weeks ago, we suffered a terrible kind of hurricane and tornado, which was one of the kind of probably a 1 in 50-year weather event, which kind of devastated a lot of our trees and our homes. So feeling a lot more on the forefront of some of the downsides of the SDGs at the moment. But my personal background, I'm currently working as the Chief Sustainability Officer for Paragon Impact, of which I'll tell you a bit more about that company shortly. But my whole career started very much from an environmental science background. I've got a degree in environmental chemistry, and at that point in my career, I realized of all the major environmental issues that were playing out, I felt climate change was the one that looked the most challenging. So I went on to study an MSc in climate change, and I graduated from that in 2007 into the financial crisis. And I was looking around to find roles where I could advise business on climate and climate change, but sadly, the roles just disappeared along with all the consequences of that financial crash. The only opportunity I could see for advising business on climate change was some work that my professors at my university were doing, but they only recruited people who had PhDs, and I sadly wasn't at that there. So I thought, well, how am I going to infiltrate myself into business and try and understand what it is about business that they are not understanding about climate and the issues that climate presents. So I Trojan horsed myself into the City of London as a consultant, and I've worked for many years as a strategy and transformation consultant in some of the largest banks in the city, which was insightful, and it was very clear that this idea of sustainability was just not present at the operational level of business, let alone at the strategic level. It was just absent. So in more recent years, I did my MBA at Warwick Business School, and kindly Fred supervised my thesis, where I looked into business and how they are trying to embed their sustainability governance. And that led me on the trajectory to becoming more of a sustainability consultant. The market and demand has certainly picked up in the last 5 years. And I've been working with all sorts of business, from FTSE 100 through to the UN, and even to local businesses in Jersey, trying to embed sustainability practice and mature the sustainability practice of business. So that's been a great career. I'm really delighted that finally sustainability is something that people to have in their daily discourse. We're seeing the increase in disclosures of sustainability. The practice is definitely maturing. But I will talk about some of the trends I'm seeing as I work with clients shortly. I wanted to give you a little bit of the background of the company I work for. Unlike Joe's business, my business has only been around for about 2 years. We're a startup called Paragon Impact. And Paragon Impact essentially measures the performance of a business, its impact performance, using the SDGs as the government's framework from which to measure that performance. And we do this really in 2 steps. The first step is that we define the materiality, double materiality of the business who's engaged us. So we'll take all 17 SDGs and we'll hold a very interactive and energetic workshop with the C-suite of that company to determine which of the SDGs are actually core to the operations of that business. And we look through 2 lenses of double materiality. That's what is the impact that the business is having on the outside world. We also take the consideration of how the external risks that are being presented through the likes of climate or social unrest might have financial impact on the company as well. And through that workshop, we really allow the C-suite to engage with the SDGs in a way that they may never have done before. It's a lot of challenge, it's a lot of consensus building. But the idea is that we come up with around six 7 SDGs that we know that the business is actually having concrete impact on. And that impact is something that they have control over. It might be they have strategic intent on. And we then prioritize the SDGs through important, peripheral and negligible as the control that they have on them diminishes. So we end up with this, what we like to call the impact North Star, so that businesses can actually identify that there's only a subset of those SDGs that they can control, that they can have impact on. And we recommend business to just focus on those ones when they're trying to improve their impact performance, and leave the other SDGs to businesses who have control on those ones. What I'll tell you shortly is that we find a lot of our clients and a lot of business in general, when they come to address the SDGs, they think that they have to solve all of them. But we definitely don't think from our company's perspective that that's the right solution. We really try and push them towards those SDGs which they do have an ability to impact. So once we've performed double materiality, we then go on to doing a full impact assessment. And what that looks like is we have to gather huge amounts of data from the client. We'll look at the whole array of the SDGs. We'll be looking at the economic impacts they have. So how much tax do they contribute to their local economy, all the way through to the gender diversity on their boards. How many security breaches does the company have every year? And our team of impact analysts will generate a performance view on how the company is performing across the SDGs. And that will come out as a graded output that looks quite similar to kind of a financial rating grading from A+ all the way through to C-. And we also present where the business is having positive, negative impact. What magnitude is it? What severity is it? How probable is it that that impact's happening? And really present a way of presenting that impact, which is generally quite intangible, and making it much more tangible, demonstrating to the business often things that they have never seen or appreciated before. So that's what we do. It's a really young company, and the demand is, we feel like we're market making because there's not a huge amount of companies who are kind of bashing our door down, and we're really having to sell what we do quite coherently to business at the moment. We do hope that will change. But as we do go around and talk to businesses in all sorts of sectors and across the world, I wanted to share with you some of the trends that we're seeing come out of those conversations. We're definitely seeing the term impact as a kind of new, well, it's not a new term, but a term that's being used more commonly. We're definitely seeing clients who are generating impact reports. I think that's kind of the next evolution of sustainability reporting. I've noticed Tesla, for example. I know we all know Elon Musk's not a big fan of ESG, but they create an impact report. And I think one of the reasons why we see this trend, and the mining industry is a really great example of that. This is that some industries like mining get hammered quite heavily on the environmental and sometimes the social side of their operations. But when we talk to them and tell them about the products that we have, they are delighted, because when you use the SDGs as a framework to measure the sustainability performance of a business, they feel that they're getting a much more objective kind of view of their contribution to society and the environment, because the SDGs cover that governance and economic side that often they aren't given credit for. They feel they're often feeling that they're quite heavily bashed on the environment and sometimes on the social side too. Whereas the SDGs get to present that kind of wider value and impact that they create, that they feel is contributing positively, whilst they accept that there's a lot of negative impact that they have too. We find on the awareness piece, Joe picked up there that the awareness is variable. I think that what we see is there's still a really long way to go in general awareness of the SDGs and how they apply to the private sector. We find a lot of people still stuck in this belief that the SDGs are purely for developing nations. They're really for government level application, because the application from the private sector level is just not clear. So how do you start on that journey is often one of the challenges that we get asked. We also see this kind of theme coming out where companies say to us that they've aligned with the SDGs, and what we find is they might have just picked one SDG that they like. So often in Jersey, we find it's they'll pick SDG 14, which is life underwater, because we live on an island and they quite like going to the beach, which, you know, whilst we encourage that there's some sort of interaction with the SDGs, it's obviously quite superficial in some instances, and we try and re-educate them where we can, but it's really hard to move them away from the kind of more liking into the reality of impact that they're generating at times. We definitely find many pitfalls and barriers to making progress with the SDGs. We have the SDGs as our core framework because we simply think there's no better framework to measure sustainability against. It's the best we have. But we do find a lot of problems with it as we try and apply it to business. Some of those include when you try to engage with the SDGs purely at their face value, you just can't appreciate some of the detail behind the 169 targets behind them. Joe, I think you touched on that before, that the devil's in the detail with the SDGs, and it's really having to kind of engage with them on their lower layer where you really get the understanding of what they're trying to achieve. And with that, we also find that they're insanely interconnected. They try to in a very simple way present the complexity of sustainable development, which when you try and kind of go into it, it's huge, complex systems thinking type issues playing out there. One SDG has a huge amount of spillover into other SDGs and vice versa. So trying to neatly package and impact measure anything is always going to come with huge amounts of caveat that it's simply not, you've got to appreciate the systems thinking that will likely play out. If you do positive impacts in one place, it might generate negative impacts elsewhere. So we're trying to work with this very dynamic and non-linear environment. And I also, from a personal level, feel the SDGs are lacking on their emphasis in certain places. For example, I think it doesn't really cover the appreciation of how businesses channel capital towards sustainable outcomes. I think that that's very weak in the SDGs. And I know the sustainable finance movement tries to overcome that. But I think if the SDGs could more clearly emphasize channeling capital to sustainable outcomes, I think it would boost it as a framework. But I will leave it there and hand back to the floor.
Very good. Thank you very much, Amy. Again, lots of great food for thought there, and very grateful for your time and contribution to see and hear how you've sort of worked with the SDGs in your roles and in the private sector, trying to get them to adopt this sort of lens of impact, but also the ensuing challenges of measuring this accurately. So obviously, I'm aware we got a fair few attendees, and we've also had a couple of questions coming in, and maybe we'll pick up on some of those questions first, and if there's time, obviously we can bring in our own from the panel. So I see that Pamela's asked us to think a little bit about the relationship between the SDGs and other types of sustainability metrics, and we talked about this here in the sort of room before we started the webinar. I know this acronym of ESG is obviously so widely used within the private sector, and yet here we come from the sort of more wider political domain of international development and the UN SDG. So how do you work with those challenges of having so many different acronyms and standards and frameworks in place? So just sort of from both of your experience, does that make life easier or harder?
And Fred, right before we do, perhaps moving into discussion, we want to unshare the slide.
Yeah, do that.
Great.
Yeah, Amy, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think sustainability really doesn't help itself by having all these alphabet soup jargon. It really, I think, puts people off at the outset. And what we find, there's a harmonization of a lot of these standards. And what we've had to do in our own business is take the SDGs and map the GRI indicators in, map the SASB indicators in, and kind of make calls ourselves about how those standards all talk to each other. It's a common issue, and then there's some things around the SDGs which are almost unmeasurable, not possible to measure. Things around no poverty, things around zero hunger. We really struggle to get to measurement that the GRI SASB simply doesn't have metrics that support that. So I think for me, the SDGs struggle from their ability of where you can measure some of their effects and where you can't. And then you naturally just kind of find a lot of people in the private sector will navigate towards the areas that you can measure. So gender diversity on boards, it's very easy to count, who's on the board, or carbon footprint is getting easier. But some of those other SDGs that just simply don't have quantifiable metrics are, I think, losing out.
Great, thank you. Jo, do you have sort of
well, not a huge amount to add, really. I mean, Amy's kind of summed it up, really. We need to have, we've got too many reporting mechanisms out there, full stop. It makes it very difficult for us to really measure any type of proper performance. Wouldn't it be great if we all aligned to one standard way of measuring our progress? And wouldn't it be great if there's the SDG using that as a framework? But we don't. We have multiple ones, which make it very difficult for businesses, especially because some have been using GRI for many years, for example, and actually it's so structured, it's very difficult to bring the SDGs in there. It takes a lot of work. And it seems like every year we get another type of reporting mechanism out there. So very complex and difficult to do. And certainly from my own experience of working for an SME, we simply don't have the capacity. We don't have the resources to be able to do that effectively. And, the majority of organisations out there are SMEs. Who collectively have a very big impact. So we really need to be engaging them in the process, but you're not going to do it by any of those metrics because it's just far too complicated. And therefore we get to a state of apathy, thinking, well, we can't really do much at all, we won't bother, which is absolutely what we don't want.
Thank you, Jo. So some good comments, especially there regarding the nature of business, which for those is worth stressing that we often think of the big, large corporates, multinationals with the biggest impacts and the longest supply chains, and yet the vast majority of people and companies are working organizations that are small, medium-sized, sometimes family-owned, privately owned, that in many ways sort of avoid the limelight, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And so I think it is important to reflect on the role of the private sector through that lens of diversity of different types of organizations. State-owned companies, for instance, as well, and in other parts of the world are quite important actors just as much. David asked a good question about the future of the SDGs, which I'm more than happy to pick up, but maybe leave that to the end. Let's focus on the role of the SDGs while we still have them. And maybe what struck me from both of you was that that engagement with the private sector sometimes was sort of driven quite deliberately and intentional. You sort of refer to the SDGs in your interactions, but also I think, as Jo mentioned, that sometimes that either there's a complete lack of awareness where companies are thinking it's a sort of development framework rather than something that applies to all companies and organizations and countries. And to the point that you said, well, actually, you have to sometimes do this on the slide without being quite open and about this. I think what does that tell us about maybe the appeal or the awareness, the global engagement with this framework? And again, you may have sort of views and perspectives that are driven by your experience in the UK and the West, but still, I think do we think that the SDGs have led to a global recognition, have global brand and power in that sense, or? Very patchy.
Yeah. So I can only talk on a practitioner level and working with organisations and embedding the SDGs through leadership development, because that's what we design for organisations. So I have a very specific viewpoint on it. I can go a little bit wider, but I'm always looking for alignment with the work I'm doing. I'm always trying to understand, where is this organisation's vision? What's it trying to achieve? What's its external ambitions? And I see my role as aligning that external ambition with what we're delivering in terms of leadership development. And so the SDGs for me is about trying to help bridge that gap within organisations. The amount of times I will look on an organisation's website and see how passionate they are about sustainability or the SDGs, and then I talk to somebody in learning development and they go, never heard of it. Don't even know that we're doing that. It's like they're working in different organisations. So I see my role is bridging the gap between where the organisation says it wants to be and then working with L&D to kind of say, hey, you know what, by doing this SDG related project and raising awareness, it's going to help your organisation achieve the wider ambitions that it has. So I see my role as bridging the gap between that. I think genuinely, even though organisations talk about they've embedded the SDGs or sustainability within their organisation, really it's still that department over there that does it. And I see that a lot in organisations. So that's where the stealth light comes in. Like, I'll just put it in there in another way and just help to raise that awareness. For other organisations, when they're really clear about their ambitions, like when I talked about VITA, then it's really easy to design projects that use the SDGs. Hope that makes sense.
Amy, your thoughts?
I'm trying to think and expand on it. I think Joe's pretty much covered everything there. The difference I have is when people engage us, they've already bought into the SDGs. We often only work with companies. So when you go into the market trying to sell my product, you kind of have two choices. You either go to those who have already get it and bought in, or you can try and convince those who just haven't got it or ever understood what the SDGs are and try and convince them. And we simply just go for the lower hanging fruit. But we do find that is fewer companies. There are some businesses who will be looking at their competitive environment and saying, well, you know what, there's this whole opportunity around sustainability where we can really stand out and differentiate ourselves. And you know, for me, sustainability is a new dimension of competitive advantage that those more enlightened companies that come to us often are trying to achieve. So there's huge numbers of players in industry who haven't identified that opportunity for the competitive play with sustainability. So yeah, you see just such differing maturity as you go into the market. I think that there was a really great report that came out by Accenture earlier this year. It was a stock take report where they looked at the progress being made by the SDGs, by the private sector on the SDGs. And they surveyed about 2,500 companies, and they kind of came out with these 4 barriers that they perceive are stopping the private sector from really embracing SDGs. And that's 4 interesting things. So the first one was businesses are finding it hard to influence their supply chain. So even if they understand what the SDGs are and they're trying to achieve them, then their supply chain are harder to influence. The second barrier that they raised was just the long payback period. So even if you do try to align with the SDGs, try and invest and you know, really deliver deep sustainability practice, that just get such long payback periods, it's hard to justify from a financial perspective. And there was this other piece which is very much around the lack of policy incentives. So there's simply not the policy to support the private sector on this endeavour. And I definitely think I agree with all those 3 when I talk to business.
Thank you. The policy side certainly sounds interesting, and you know the way in which you describe the barriers there certainly make me reflect on the point you made earlier also about the opportunities for channeling capital towards sustainable outcomes. So in your discussions with investors and people who are making those sort of investment choices, do you think that the SDGs are primarily seen as a risk tools, a bit like ESG, in that you say, well, we know that all these 17 goals that are in some ways have potentially negative implications for the financial bottom line, and therefore we need to ensure that we address them by meeting regulations and legislation and ensuring compliance, or do you think there is also an understanding of the opportunities involved? And I know that people always refer to this as the order book from the future. If you're a company, if you want to know what the world actually needs, just go to the SDGs, because that tells you in a nutshell the billions and trillions of economic opportunities. And yet it doesn't necessarily seem to come across in this way. Or do you agree, or did you find that investors are, and managers and leaders are more open-minded about this now?
It's an interesting one. So what I think on the policy side, I do think that there is a lot of regulation coming up that aligns with sustainability. It's just that people don't even realize it is a sustainability issue. I'll give you some examples like GDPR, data security. That is a sustainability issue from the governance side. And you know, when you inform you know, clients and businesses about that, they just go, oh, I thought that was an IT thing, you know. Actually, there is a large number of regulations that are out there. It's just, I don't think, you know, putting that puzzle piece together and saying, actually, this does support sustainability in this way. Nobody is making those connections for people. So that I don't think people realize that, you know, there's minor, like mini regulations that are being put out there to support sustainability, but it's just not recognized as sustainability. And I think that the maturity around, you know, seeing the SDGs as that kind of risk, you know, identifying risk versus identifying opportunity. Definitely yet more on the risk side with investors. The opportunity that you can deliver using the SDGs and harnessing them is very much not appreciated by most stakeholders I talk to.
Anything to add, Joe, from your side?
No, nothing to add on that one. I think it was articulated it well.
So does that mean, I mean, you know, Joe, you're working with companies through projects, I believe, mostly, or through leadership and other types of engagement. Does that mean there's a greater need for ensuring that entrepreneurs and startups, people who are sort of at the cutting edge of coming up with new organizations, business ideas, business models, technologies, that do you see that they, or sense that perhaps they are more engaged with the SDGs as a starting point for their activities in the private sector? Do you see more sort of innovation almost happening at that side, or is it still sort of largely the incumbents and established organizations and businesses?
I think if you're a startup, you're acutely more aware of the social, wider environmental social issues, and are in a really good place to start with good intentions. I think for a lot of organizations, bigger organizations who have been probably adopting some sort of sustainability over the last, 10 or so years, I think it's more challenging for them because they've already got quite a well set out agenda in which the SDGs just doesn't map onto it well at all. So I think it's just difficult. Whereas a startup, I think, operating in the environment we're in now, I think startups are thinking much more with a kind of holistic approach to doing business, doing business differently, and are really well set up to embed the SDGs. I think the SDGs, if you're starting out and you don't have much of a strategy in place, SDGs are wonderful. As Amy and others have said, it tells you exactly what you need to do and how to do it. It's perfect, but it just doesn't fit if you're halfway through your own strategy. It's just really difficult. It's a square peg round hole scenario, I think. But yeah, startups, I think, they're just operating in a very different environment.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Another question that occurred to me is really around the role of partnerships and relationships between private sector and public sector. Do you see much of that happening, much interest in that space, and the extent to which companies perhaps go out intentionally to work with other actors from other sectors to address issues, or is this almost goes even well beyond managing their own issues and challenges?
Joe, do you know?
Well, I mean, again,
or not. If you say no, there isn't. That's fine.
I mean, it should be, shouldn't it? It should be a really, I mean, we know goal 17, it's, goal 17 really should go with any of the other goals, because it's about enabling action to happen. And we know we actually can't address any of these issues unless we are able to partner effectively. I love this idea of partnering. We make it sound so simple. It's so difficult to do, which is why most partnerships don't work. But it does provide us with a great framework in which to start that conversation and identify how we can collectively take some action. 2017, I went to a conference that was all about how governments were leading on the SDGs, and I was so slightly embarrassed to be British at the time, because Germany talked about how easy it was to implement the SDGs because you have a minister for different parts of the of society. So you just say, to the Minister of Infrastructure, well, your goal 12, and you even it out, and he make it sound so simple. And then somebody from the UK, I don't know who it was at the time, just was stumbling around the challenges for government to embed this. It's so complicated and difficult. And I thought, Germany's just talked about it and they've made it sound so simple and make it make sense. So I think we can overcomplicate this stuff as well. So yes, I think goal 17, we need to be able to work collectively and collaboratively and partner on addressing any of these issues. And that's tough. It's really tough to do, but it shouldn't be that much of a barrier.
Okay. There's a question that Pamela asked, another question around any successful examples of the use of SDGs for creating collective impact. Anything that you've come across or seen?
Think about that.
So one of the programs I work with or deliver on with the UN Global Compact, which is working with the under 35-year-olds who are incredibly talented and passionate and hardworking, and their role is to come up with new products or services that embed the SDGs and align with their organisation. And I've seen some great examples of how, for example, Scottish Power are doing this great idea with seaweed and wind power. So there are always going to be pockets of great innovation and collaboration. It's just not enough, but certainly there are some really good examples. I'm trying to think of other organisations that really lead with it. Yes, I'll have to come back to you.
Good stuff. No, but I would agree. There's sort of, as you said, pockets of innovation, but there's not enough systemic change, I think, as what was hoped for through the SDGs, and we're certainly moving away from that. Maybe speaking of that, we had this point just before. We've just come to the end of COP in Dubai. What do you think, or what are your sort of thoughts on the role of these sort of international frameworks and agreements, more generally speaking, whether it's on climate, biodiversity, SDGs? What's the role for big politics, international politics, and driving changes? Are they effective in terms of driving the agenda and the level of direction? What hope is there?
I think for me, it was remarkable to see at COP28 how much private sector presence there was. And if you looked at that trajectory over time, it's just been incredible. I see people in Jersey going to COP28, whereas a few years ago, that would have never happened. And I really think that there is a lot of lobbying and influence coming from private sector to really put a lot of pressure on the using the phase out of fossil fuels terminology. So I think the private sector are really putting their lobbying power behind them, and I think it's important that they continue to do so.
can only take it on action that happens as a result of COPs. And again, I think it's a great galvanizing place. And I think you're right, Amy. I think there's so much appetite from private sector in really driving change. They are. It shouldn't just be them, though. It needs to have government. It needs to have a much more kind of actual action that's happening as a result of COP28. And I look at like phasing out of fossil fuels. Still, there's quite a few that don't support it or oppose it, and they're big countries that are not supporting it. And without that, and there's no dates on anything, I get a little bit disheartened by this. But I am, I kind of feel that it's within private sector to make the change happen. Because they have the resources and the intention and the capabilities, but it needs to be also driven by regulation and by legislation, and there's not enough action. There's just not enough action right now.
Not enough action. So let me, mindful of the time, come back to the question that David posed earlier. So we're 2023. We've got 7 years, halfway through the SDGs. So there's a bit of time to maybe ramp up action and really try and make progress on these goals and issues. But if that doesn't happen, what's the future? What do you think? Do you hear anything about almost a wish list or of ideas of, you talk about don't overcomplicating it. Are 17 goals and 169 targets ultimately too ambitious in order to be effective? I know I have colleagues who are very cynical about this because they say no company can effectively integrate that into a strategy. But it does reflect obviously the multitude of complexity of issues that the world faces. But what are you hearing? What's the future? What should we be planning for, hoping for, or aiming for?
I think one of the drawbacks of the SDGs is that in the 15 years of the agenda, things are changing. So we need AI to be on the SDG framework. We need how we treat animals to be on the SDG framework. So I think that it's got to be able to adapt to the latest issues that sustainability is throwing up at us, and that's one of the things I hope is that it become more adaptable and more prescriptive and useful for the private sector.
Okay, Joe.
I think I'm a real strong believer that people care about this stuff. I think it might not be the thing that you care around in terms of sustainability, but I think people care about it, and I think the SDGs provides that kind of that framework to help people engage with what matters to them. And also know that they have agency and they can make change happen within our own sphere of influence. And so I think my hope is that people can see and understand what matters to them and feel a sense of agency about making change happen. And if we can help people within organisations see what they can do, and it needs to also be supported by government to kind of push those laggards who won't change unless they really have to, because there is a big population of organisations who will wait until that happens, and that's going to slow us down. So know that people care, tap into what it is, help them make that change happen.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Joe and Amy. It's been fantastic listening to your accounts of what your companies and organisations are doing, and I know you're very passionate about the SDGs. We've got our work cut out for sure. Everyone across the room, I'm sure, will be very mindful and understanding of that. But we do hope we're all making progress, and through this webinar, give you some insights into the role of the private sector. I think we can learn from each other and work together. So hopefully that things are improving over time. But on behalf of everyone involved, Joanna Stanberry and Janice Boulder and everyone else at the ESG academic community, thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of the day, and do please keep in touch with us. It'd be great to keep the conversation going in some other form. Have a great day. Thank you all.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Joanna. Bye, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Just stop the recording as well.